Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's conversation about building versus buying in the context of data generation. I'm your host, Kiara from Tonic.ai, and I'm very glad to be joined again by our speakers, Mark Mercado from the CTO and founder of Mockaroo, and Andrew Colombi, co-founder and CTO of Tonic.ai. We've got a lot of great questions already lined up to ask them, but we also love to hear your questions. So please drop them in the Q&A. I'll also be looking for them in the chat as well. Either place, I'll keep my eyes out for them and share them with the speakers as they come up. Cool. I'm going to kick things off with a question for Mark. For those of you who have joined our webinars in the past with Mark, you may have already heard, like I've heard, kind of a high-level origin story of Mockaroo about how you were working. Was it health sciences or health tech?
Yeah, it was a healthcare company, a startup, a long time ago. Probably about 10 years ago now. It's almost coming up on the 10th anniversary of Mockaroo.
Cool.
I was leading an engineering team there, and it was just a very difficult domain to learn. And so the QA testers who were very junior, some of them were interns, like they didn't really create very meaningful data to test the application just by hand. So I created this in-house tool to make it easier to create meaningful data so that their tests were more meaningful and easier to follow from start to finish in some kind of difficult workflows. That's the origin.
Cool. I was just kind of wondering about that, like what led you to build in-house versus seeking out the buy option.
That's funny. I'm a developer, so I want to build everything. I just that's my natural tendency. And probably a lot of times in my career, I've gone down the path of building things that I probably shouldn't have. But it has strengthened a muscle in problem solving and building for sure, while maybe wasting some time along the way. This was one where I actually did look around at the time, and probably still the number 2 result on Google for like generating fake data is this generatedata.com. And it was pretty simplistic. I don't think it's really changed in the 10 years that Mockaroo's been around. And it was like really low scale. And at the time I was working with Ruby on Rails that had some really great faking libraries that were part of just kind of the standard Rails way of doing unit testing. And I was like, well, I know my QA engineers who are really not coders are not going to use this library, but what if I just slapped a UI on, I think it wasn't Faker, it was another one. But I just essentially just slapped a UI on some of the things that it could do out of the box. And I probably wrote the UI in like Bootstrap or something like that, and a Rails backend. And threw it up there, and it was like pretty useful immediately. But I don't know that I really did I didn't do the thing that like a VP or a CTO would do, which is like go out and find all the tools and get demos, and just too eager. It was a startup, throwing things together. I've done quite a lot of that in my career, and I've seen some bad ones too. I remember that same company many years earlier had actually written its own bug tracker, if you believe that. They weren't using, a Bugzilla, or they weren't using a Jira. I think this was before Jira was kind of mainstream, but they wrote their own bug tracker in Cold Fusion. And this was an interesting thing because when we switched, I think we switched to Bugzilla many years later, because it's like the thing that you always find with build versus buy is like, you built it, that was fun, it works in the beginning, and then the guy who builds it leaves, and you're like, wow, now we have to maintain this thing, aside from the things that actually make us money, and that's not a good thing. And it was a perfect workflow for our company, way better than what like Bugzilla could provide. It had like a lot of assumptions of how we work built in, and it was like just perfectly crafted. But then like maintaining that was just a nightmare. And then at one point, I think like the server died and no one knew how to like restart it. And it was like, all right, now we're off to Bugzilla. So yeah, some crazy things there.
That's like abrupt evolution right there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's often I see what happens.
Did you see the chat? Someone says, Mark, they built their own bug tracker. Everybody, he's talking about my company.
Yeah.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah. And it's funny, I keep like threatening with every team that I'm going to go and build my own darn bug tracker again, because I don't like any of the ones that are out there, to be honest. Like I've used Jira over and over again. And now the joke has been every company I've worked for always says, the problem's not Jira, it's our setup of Jira. But it's like every one of them says the same thing. So maybe it is actually Jira. I don't know. We actually, I'll get off my rant in a little bit, but we actually just started using an app called ClickUp, which I think is like raised a bunch of money and they're getting super popular. It's like an all-in-one OS for a company, and amongst the many things it does, it can be a bug tracker and track sprints and all that. It actually does it quite well. So if anybody's interested, check out ClickUp.
Andrew and Tonic, have we built our own bug tracker?
No, we didn't. We're too young a company to fall into that trap, and too young a company and too old of developers to fall into that trap. We used GitHub from the start, and we use Asana a little bit as well. But yeah, no, we didn't do that. But I've definitely been like, yeah, I think every developer has experienced that moment. And actually, there are some companies that can do it, right? Like Microsoft and Google, they have their own bug trackers, and they can get away with it because like a fraction of a percent improvement for the efficiency of Google means millions of dollars. So it's worth like billions, maybe not billions, but like, yeah, like you could look at the revenue of Google. I bet you a 1% improvement in their productivity is billions of dollars. So they can spend $2 million making a bug tracker software if it makes them 1% faster.
Cool. Well, since I asked you for your take on Tonic, I'd love to get some of your background story as well. Andrew, when you were at Palantir, I know that part of the reason Tonic was founded is because your experience at Palantir with some of the co-founders was that you and the engineers often had to build fake data in-house. What did that look like?
Yeah. So, when we were confronted with this question of like, how are we going to get the fake data? Our situation was kind of similar, very similar, right? We had like QA that wasn't able to get really good passes in on when they were doing testing because they didn't have proper data. And then developers were making bad assumptions as they were developing the tools because they didn't have good data. And similarly, I kind of just jumped right into how do we solve this? I didn't even consider. I think that's true, by the way, of this problem. This problem of like, we have data that we need to create for our testing. It's always starts with let's build something ourselves. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One of them, this is kind of a tangent, I'm aware, but I think it's worth mentioning. One of them is that like, I think people think it's easy. It sounds easy, right? Like we're gonna build some fake data. I mean, surely that can't be that hard. Two, it feels like it's going to be very bespoke to your needs, right? Like I have a MySQL database that has these things like triggers in it or integrations with our AD. And there's like all these stories you tell yourself of like how our data or our setup is different than anyone else's, and it won't be that hard, that lead you to this conclusion of like, well, we should build it ourselves. So I think that's one of the reasons why like this story, when you hear what our stories, Mark and mine, are very similar. It's because it's like we kind of coming from it the same. There's these like commonalities there. But going back to the Palantir story, so yeah, me and the other co-founders of Tonic decided, we don't want to find these issues in the field anymore. We would like them to be surfaced earlier. And also, by the way, when we found issues in the field, like the devs couldn't repro it. So even if we are finding issues in the field, the least we can do is allow the devs to repro it. And so we embarked on the journey, and it was harder than we thought it would be, but it was also more valuable than we thought it would be, which I think is kind of the interesting flip side of that coin. It's like, yeah, it was harder. It took months instead of days. But the data we produced ended up being super useful, well beyond the scope of the project that we initially had scoped it for. Initially we were like, okay, we're going to use it for this, specific project we're working with a specific client. And we faked data that was specific to that client. But it turned out that there were other clients that had similar data setups. And so the data became useful for them. And also, generally speaking, when our salespeople are doing demos for customers, just having really, really intricate, sophisticated data, even if it isn't exactly the data that the client would otherwise want to see, can be very, very valuable. So I feel like if you look at like the lifetime of the project, and not the data project, but rather the project we were trying to support, that project probably had like a year and a half worth of legs to it, where we were using the data that we generated for it. But the data itself got used in other projects for years. Like 3, 4, 5 years later, that data was still being used. So that's where I think it was harder than we thought it would be, but also it was more valuable than we thought it would be. So that kind of made it worth it.
And when you say that data, was it just like the data you generated at one time, or like the infrastructure that you created?
The data we generated at one time, because it was really hard to make infrastructure. It's even like as hard as it was to make the data once, making infrastructure to make that data, and get out of here. I've seen so many projects to make infrastructure for data fail internally. Like internal versions of that product are very, very difficult. I mean, that's why we made a company for it, and that's why we have like 45 people working on it. You know.
Yeah, that was actually another part of my question, was how many people at Palantir, like you mentioned months to do that, and how many people were involved?
You know, it was like, honestly, a lot of the development was me. But then there was a lot of research into like, what should the data look like? That was the other person I was working with, which was in one project, it was Ian, and the other project, it was Carl. Guess what? My co-founders are Ian and Carl, you know? So, yeah, so there you go.
Yeah, that's kind of the problem. Like the person with the instinct and drive to go create that kind of a solution is like not long for maintaining that kind of a solution. They're probably going to go be the CTO somewhere, you know, then it's some other poor fellow that's stuck with maintaining it. So yeah.
And then in your case, you know, Mark, you have maintained Mockaroo and you've built it out, and it's become just more and more powerful over the years. And I'm wondering if you could like guesstimate, you know, how much time you've spent. That's probably a huge question.
So I actually looked up when this started. It surprised me yesterday. Mockaroo, I started development in 2012. So it's like actually coming up on a 10-year anniversary. So I think it's something like 500 or 600 hours in total. Like I work in these like bursts. So normally in the beginning, I probably like didn't sleep for a little while. It's just like the way I am. I try to bang the whole thing out at once, and I say, how hard could it be? And then I look up 3 days later and it's like, wow, it was a little harder than I thought.
Very hard.
Yeah. But it's that kind of dumb optimism, I think, that like keeps innovation going. Probably a lot of the great things in the world that somebody started off with, like, how hard could it be? And then they're looking back and saying that was ridiculous. I'm never doing that again.
Ignorance is a bliss.
Yeah, it is.
Could you like explain like some of the aspects that made it like just really hard? Like what was it that?
Scaling for one, it was like really hard. It's the, I don't know, 80-20 or 90-10 rule of like, it always feels like you're so close to having something that's viable. And then actually sometimes when you get something that's viable, then like the next person says, well, if only I could do that, but like a little bit more. And then you realize, oops, a little bit more is a lot more work. Like on the surface, it looks like it's going to be this wonderful solution, but then somebody wants to correlate two data sets and it's like, it's not built to do that. Or somebody likes the 1,000 records they could generate, but they need like 10 million. Well, it's not built to do that either. So once you've got something that you're happy with in place, and then trying to turn it into what people actually need without breaking that original thing that made it good is it's difficult to make that change in place, I think. So that took a lot of effort for sure. And then also, you know, when you're a single person kind of unconstrained in your choices, I made a lot of wandering choices as I was doing it, just to learn things along the way as an engineer. Like Mockaroo did not start out as a business. It started out as a project for me to learn things and grow my skills in a way to vent, do something completely different that I was doing at the time. So, you know, I didn't have like strict requirements or timelines or anything. So I wandered and made some choices that needed cleaning up later. Like at one point, I think I had React, Angular, and Backbone all in the front end. It was kind of fun. Yeah. Hey, don't joke.
Dare you?
we were talking about Astro. Astro actually has a demo where you can run all of the frameworks on one page. That's actually a value proposition of it. Yeah, for large companies that do micro front ends, it's actually becoming a thing now. But see, I was ahead of my time. Yeah, so very wandering path to where I am now for sure.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, you say ahead of your time. Well, if you started developing it in 2012, I think you probably very much definitely ahead of your time. And then it wasn't until 2014, right, that you launched it online. Is that right?
It was about that. I think it probably was out there for like a year on the internet, just taking like PayPal donations or something. I wanted to see if anybody was actually interested in this. And then all of a sudden, there was a very big customer that came and wanted it to do some things that were well beyond its capacity. And like any smart entrepreneur out there, just always say yes when somebody asks you, can it happen? And then figure it out later, which is I did. And it really, drove me to success. Having that pressure was kind of nice.
Yeah. So like you said, we're almost a decade after the launch of Mockaroo, about coming up on 4 years since the founding of Tonic. And now, you're both founders and CTOs of viable fake data solutions coming from that background in the building house. I think that speaks volumes in and of itself. So you've kind of touched on this, like you both said, this is building house is just the default for the type of people, because of those considerations you mentioned, Andrew. So how often do you speak with teams, like as, a sellable product, do you speak with teams who are considering building in-house or have already attempted to build something in-house? Like,
I would say it's like every time.
Every time.
Yeah.
Every time.
I mean, that's probably an exaggeration, but it's like 90% of the time. It depends on the company to a degree. Like if the company is really small, really young, then maybe they haven't tried yet because they're just that young. It's like their first step was, well, maybe we can buy it. But if the company is more than 3 or 4 years old, they're going to have something in place, or they're going to have tried something in place. And yeah, I think a lot of what Tonic sells to is a lot of what Tonic competes with is build your own. Also, a lot of what it sells to is replace what you built that you don't like. For sure. And we've had customers, Tonic has had customers that they did the pilot and then the pilot did not end up closing, like did not succeed. And then a month later, they come back and they're like, hey, how about we do this after all? And it hasn't happened a lot. It's like a small handful because we don't actually lose that many pilots. Almost all of our pilots succeed. But there's been a fraction of those pilots that didn't succeed that actually came back later. And it's because I think also part of the assumption of build it yourself is the calculus you do is like, well, Tonic is going to cost X. I could hire someone to do it for Y, and they'll do it exactly what we need. So maybe I pay the Y instead of the X and I can get the thing I want. But they don't counter in there. They're just looking at Y and X. That's the only thing they're looking at. What they're not looking at is that actually Y might fail. Like building it yourself is really hard, and people don't appreciate that. And I think that there's a lot of build it yourself implies that you can build it, and actually you might not be able to. It's very difficult.
Yeah. Mark, did you have something to add to that? And I feel like you.
Yeah. So I have a different angle that I've been thinking about in some of my recent work, which is. They're calling this the Great Resignation, right? Probably maybe except you guys might be exempt because you're growing so fast, but probably everybody out there in the audience has known somebody who's been key and left their job recently, especially amongst developers. And so if you're like thinking about keeping a team together, I would really want the people on the team only working on the absolutely most interesting and rewarding and important things you can. And if you buy from like Tonic, let's say, Tonic's not going to quit on you. They have a contract and they're just going to keep serving you what you need until you don't need it anymore. But if you have somebody in-house building it, in this day with people moving around so much, there's a very good chance that small team or that one person, you could wake up and they just not be there the next day. And that's one of the scariest things about being an engineering leader right now. People are finding all sorts of great opportunities and it's great for them. It's very hard for people running teams. So I have really championed buy lots of stuff in my career now, especially from AWS, cloud services, things of that nature, observability platforms, bug trackers, bug reporting, all that stuff, because it's like, I know that stuff's not going to go away. Like the price might go up, service might occasionally go down, but I know I don't have to keep a team happy maintaining this software, which is eventually not going to be fun to maintain. That's just like the most demoralizing thing for a manager or for a team to have people leave. So it's a very different take on it, but it's top of mind for me in this last year.
That's interesting. Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. And that actually kind of ties into another question that I had for you guys, which is an example of when you chose to build something in-house. you thought that was the better path forward. And after having done that, you feel it was worth the effort of the in-house.
Yeah, I mean, for the case of Palantir, yes, I do think so. With that said, at the time, Tonic didn't exist, and if I could have bought Tonic, I definitely would have. It just didn't exist. We took some of the origin, the origin story of Tonic in many ways is creating that infrastructure. We talked about it earlier, of like, was it the infrastructure or the data? And it's like, well, we didn't have infrastructure because it was just hard enough to make the data. And so that's where Tonic is coming from. How can we create that infrastructure?
So just to be clear, I also mean like anything outside of data generation that you chose to build in-house and you felt like that was worth the effort that had to be put in.
Actually, this is like, there might be people in the audience that can point me in some interesting directions on this one. It's like Tonic has there's one weird thing about Tonic, which is we're part of a growing cohort of on-prem SaaS products, meaning that we don't have a single instance in the cloud that everyone logs into. Instead, everyone puts their own in their own VPC or whatever they, Google Cloud equivalent. And what that means is that there's a lot of product offerings out there right now for SaaS companies that are like the normal SaaS companies, like a Datadog or something like that, that don't necessarily work as well once you're an on-prem SaaS company. Like the pricing might not work right because it's like, we charge per instance, and it's like, I have no control over the number of instances. A customer will take the Tonic binary and install it on whatever instances they want, and now I have to pay for every one that they create. That's a problem. Or like, part of the infrastructure will assume that it's kind of that we have more access than we do. So for Tonic, we've kind of been occasionally forced to build stuff. Like an example of that is our logging infrastructure is a little bit in-housey on top of Vector, which is a Datadog open source project. That's pretty cool. But yeah, so if people know of, if people have experienced this and seen good ways to build or good ways to buy software that can support the on-prem SaaS product, I'd be interested to hear about that.
So you're building it in-house right now, but even then, you really want to buy something.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to all the reasons that Mark talked about keeping people excited about their work because they're working on the thing that the company is rather than supporting the thing that the company is.
Yeah.
One of the things as as an engineering leader on the team, that's the kind of stuff that you end up giving to people that can kind of take that that either want to work on DevOps stuff or that can take the hit of not working on the actual thing. And there are few of those people, right? There are more people that want to work on the actual thing,
right,
than the thing that supports the thing.
It's funny. I built a thing myself recently that I don't think exists. There's things that are like it exists. So if anybody out there has worked with a mono repo, it's a new thing that everybody's doing now. Yeah. Publish multiple packages that are all in the same version, and they need to kind of talk to one another. A lot of people put things in mono repos. Sometimes people are building apps with mono repos now, where the app and all of its libraries that support that app and maybe support other things are in that one repo. I think it's actually way overused. I think it was originally created by the folks at Babel for Babel and all of its plugins. That was Lerna is what we use in a lot of cases. It's a mono repo manager. But what I built was, we have a thing where we have a bunch of repos that need to work together, but they're all totally independent. They're released independently. They're on independent versions. There's no concept of they all must be on the same branch. They're very loosely coupled. So I built a thing that's like a mono repo manager, but it's called herding cats. and basically you could just there's one herd master that says I know what all the other repos are, and then you do herd pull, and it pulls down all those other repos and wires them up together, but they're very loosely coupled, and you can actually commit to them individually and all that. So it's you would think that something like that exists, but
I've heard of this project
find
before.
anything that was like that. Yeah,
I've heard of this project before. It happened. Something similar happened at Palantir when I worked there. But yeah, it's another example of one of those things that I guess people tend to could frequently be built themselves,
Yeah.
And it sounds like it was worth the effort and worth the, in this case.
Oh, it actually was. Yeah, the team's been using that for a very important project now for 3 or 4 months, and it like totally enabled their workflow. And I actually did build it as something like that could be open sourced, and it's meant to be more general. Whether or not it ever gets there is like whether or not I have time to do it.
Right.
But it's got tons of cool cat emojis every time you do anything. So it's fun.
Well, we've got some questions that have come through from the audience. So why don't I ask a couple of those? How flexible are your tools for integrating with my custom automation framework to generate fake data?
Well, I'll speak to the Tonic side of things. There are a couple of things that I would say around the flexibility. One, we connect to a lot of different data systems. So we can connect to tabular data systems in a database like Postgres, Oracle, MySQL, et cetera, even DB2. We connect with non-tabular sources like Mongo. We connect to tabular sources that are not databases like Spark, BigQuery, Redshift. Redshift's kind of databasey, so is BigQuery, but you get the idea. There's a lot of different connectors we can do. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is we have a pretty flexible API and and we also have webhooks in there so that you can both command Tonic from another process like a Jenkins or a Circle CI, and you can also react to Tonic, have Tonic inform you of when various things finish. So that's another part of the customization that we allow. And then the final thing is Tonic can also have custom. You can do a simple forms of programming in Tonic to enable. It's more like point and click, but to enable more custom logic if you need it. So those are the 3 areas of customization. I would have to go into more detail about what custom things you have or what things you would want to, address to be able to address the specifics, though.
Just a quick follow-up, and so this is Mark. You'll answer that first question, and also this one. Does Tonic connect to Salesforce?
Tonic currently does not have a connector to Salesforce. Yeah, we do not currently have a connector to Salesforce.
Okay, so both of those questions to you, Mark.
Well, so for Mockaroo, if you click on the upper right-hand corner on the help menu, there's a guide to the API. And so anything you can do through the front end in Mockaroo, you can totally automate with code in the API. And it's actually probably the fastest growing and also really large already use case of Mockaroo. A lot of people are building on top of Mockaroo. In fact, I think there's actually a few SaaS companies or training companies that have built products on top of Mockaroo as well, using that API. So the traffic I get on that is quite large at this point. So it is a very common thing, either in unit tests or in probably a bunch of different use cases for people to automate. So, and then there's 2 types of APIs. One is essentially you're just automating anything you could design through the front end of Mockaroo, and then there's also the ability to create your own mock APIs in Mockaroo that would be a mock of a REST API that you might one day have the real version of. So you can set up the routes and the URL patterns and the responses based on the input parameters. It's a whole API mocking tool. So yeah, that's definitely a primary use case. And Mockaroo, unlike Tonic, it doesn't connect to anything. Mockaroo spits out data in files and you can download it. So I've always had a large community of users from the Salesforce community. And I think mostly they're exporting CSV. So it's always been very widely used in Salesforce. In fact, Salesforce was my first enterprise customer.
One thing I would add is we don't currently have a connector to Salesforce. That shouldn't stop you from reaching out to our sales team. We regularly create new connectors, and it's just a matter of customer demand. We very recently released the DB2 connector, for example. We released the Mongo connector recently as well. So making new connectors is a common thing.
So a couple more connector questions regarding Salesforce in particular. Can you connect and sync Salesforce or SFTC with MySQL and then connect MySQL to Tonic? Would that be a workaround?
Yeah, totally.
And how about, can you connect to D365 and or Azure CDS?
I don't know what Azure CDS is. We do connect with many common Azure things like Postgres in Azure, MySQL in Azure, that kind of thing. but I don't know what CDS is. And what was the other one, Kara?
D365.
D365. I'll have to look that one up too. Sorry. D365, Microsoft. What is this?
Common Data Service plus Microsoft Dynamics 365.
Yeah. Again, I think this is something that we don't connect to now, but we make new connectors all the time.
Cool. A question that came in earlier: how are you tying the generated fake data to specific test use cases that you want to test in an app?
Yeah. So I'll speak to the Tonic side quickly. Typically, so what Tonic does, right, is it tries to create data like it sees in the source database. So if you have examples of the tests that you, like example scenarios that you want to test in the source database, like for example, if you have, let's say you're looking for an example of a customer that has one thing in their cart. If that exists in the source database, then Tonic will have some propensity to recreate that. What Tonic is not is like a scenario by scenario test generation thing. So what our customers have done that want specific scenarios in the output database is they identify customers, like they identify parts of their database that exhibit these things they want to test, and then tell Tonic's subsetter to extract just those examples. So you'll, for example, let's say you want to test the example I gave of the one cart in the one item in the cart. You could tell our subsetter, hey, give me examples of users with one item in their cart, and it would pull the user, pull the cart, pull the item, pull that user's history, pull other items that they purchased in the past, pull maybe other users that have purchased that item. So it's going to pull like an ecosystem of data based on that seed request. And so that's how customers have been doing it, basically using the subsetter to identify specific cases they want to hone in on and extract data that represents that use case.
That's really smart.
Yeah,
I'm kind of jealous. That's really smart.
It works pretty well.
Mockaroo, in contrast, you're essentially on your own. Mockaroo is great for creating data from scratch, where there is no prior art. So a lot of people use it for creating new products, and they may even simulate years worth of production data with it, but it's for a product that doesn't have years worth of production data. So it gives you a lot of tools for shaping the data however you want, for particular use cases or to simulate trends or sizes or integrities. But yeah, you're designing something from scratch essentially with Mockaroo.
Cool. We have a question about time series data. Someone is particularly interested in fake time series data. What are the plans for more realistic scenario building, which defines shape, syncopation, etc. of this data type, especially for ML AI training use cases? It's really hard to build something without using real data.
Yeah. We have a technology, it's called smart linking in the product, that essentially trains a variational autoencoder on data. And what we currently do with it is try to create more data that looks like the input data. But one thing we've been hypothesizing is, could we bias it? Meaning, like, let's say you wanted to shape it in a certain way, you wanted, if it's time series data, maybe you want the times to kind of trend, the values to trend up instead of trending flat or something like that. And we've been wondering if we can bias it either through some sort of rejection sampling technique or, so the way that it's kind of getting into the weeds. I'm gonna get in the weeds for just like 30 seconds, or maybe like 2 minutes. So like, basically the way the variational autoencoder can work, or the way the generation technique can work is you supply at one of the layers of the neural net kind of a random noise that is going to produce on the output layers your fake data. And if you can kind of understand a little bit about the random noise, you can affect what the outputs are going to be like. So if you can essentially provide the random noise such that you're going to get more output in the direction you want, that can be your technique for biasing the output. So the two ideas are basically rejection sampling, which is kind of straightforward. You like ask it for an output, and if you don't like it, it's not like in the bias that you want, then you throw it away. And the alternative is this kind of bias the noise that creates new data. And I talk about variational autoencoders. The other form is this technique called CT-GAN, which stands for like conditioned something GAN. I don't remember what the T is, but in that formulation, it becomes a lot easier to think about the noise layer that is like otherwise opaque, and condition the noise on some prior thing, like condition it on, I want this user to be from Boston. And so then you get like more Bostonians in your output because you've conditioned the generation process. I know that was pretty hand waving, and also it's like very difficult to describe in a minute and 40 seconds. But those are some ideas that we're working with. Right now, we just kind of try to recreate the data that is in there. If you have a use case for biasing your output in a certain direction, we could certainly connect you with our data science team that looks at this problem on the daily.
So, wow, that I cannot give a sophisticated answer like that, unfortunately.
But we've been thinking about it. Like, this is the problem for us.
I've been thinking about it, but I think I've just banged my head on it, which is like, this is really difficult. And this is why, like, I'm hoping somebody out there in the audience will just solve this for me, which is like, all right, so Mockaroo generates data starting from record 1 to record whatever, N, and it's doing it in order. And then to make it go faster, I carve that process up to multiple CPUs or multiple machines. So like one worker, okay, you get records 1 through 1,000. Another worker, you get records 1,001 through 2,000, et cetera. And it's difficult to make time series data out of that, because unless you're in a completely normal interval where like record 1 is second 1, record 2 is second 2, you don't know where record 1,000 is going to fall. So it's like you can't inform that other worker where to start. So anything that's like a well-defined sequence, it's really easy to parallelize. But anything that has to have that kind of randomness, it's quite hard. So what you can kind of do is like, you can start with a sequence and then like perturb it a little bit to like say, well, fudge it up or down a little bit, and it generates this kind of pseudo randomness. And then what you can do to simulate trends, if you don't need the randomness and the time series could be more regular, you could simulate trends by just saying, use a row number generator, which is, I think, like on the default schema in Mockaroo, the ID is a row number generator, just outputs the row number. And then derive things from that. Like you say, okay, my date or my timestamp is a constant plus that many seconds, the row number seconds. Use a formula to derive that. And then you might derive the value that you're associating with that timestamp, again, from the row number, and just say like, it's using an exponential scale or something to ramp up. And so in that way, you can generate, time series data that fits a lot of use cases, but it doesn't simulate maybe the randomness, like an imperfect trend that you might see a lot in IoT.
Yeah.
So I'd love to have a solution to that problem that's scaled, but I don't.
Yeah, there's like, sometimes I like to divide the series problem into two components. Like one component is like, when do the events happen? Like when do the measurements happen, or whatever you want to call it? And then what does the data look like at the event? And I wrote a blog post in the early days of Tonic, when I still wrote blog posts about how to do event timing. And it's pretty interesting stuff you can do with Poisson processes. There are more sophisticated answers these days, but I feel like the Poisson process is just your go-to for inter-event arrival times. It's an oldie but a goodie.
I mean, we still point people to that all the time whenever they ask about time series. All right, another question is or does the data faking process have repeatable results, i.e. the results are the same every time? If yes, do you also have referential integrity across different platforms, different distributed systems, mainframe, et cetera?
Yeah, yes is a short answer. Then there's like some more nuance, but referential integrity is a very important thing for Tonic users. So we like spend a lot of time trying to make that possible. And certainly almost all of our customers are working with multiple databases and needing it to work across all of them, so that a user ID in one is going to match with the user ID in another, et cetera, even after you've applied the transforms. So that for sure. Now, like, the exact parsing of your question, if you said like, can you always get the same input or same output from, from Tonic? It does depend a little bit. At least on the referential integrity part, I can give you a thumbs up. But like, if your input data changes and the statistics of that change, then Tonic is going to learn a new state of the world. It's going to be like, well, this is what my data looks like now, and it's going to try to replicate that. So the answer is caveated with as long as the input data also doesn't change.
And does consistency play into the answer to this question as well?
Yeah, exactly. That's a big part of it. There's a feature in Tonic called consistency, which is directly addressing this question of like, how do I keep IDs consistent across multiple systems? And it's not just IDs, you can do a lot with it. IDs are a very important use case, but just as like an idea to give you a shape of what's going on, you can tell Tonic like, I want this value to be consistent on this ID. So examples would be, I want the name to be consistent on the ID. So whenever I see ID 157, I get the name Andrew. And that means no matter what database I am on, if I see ID 157, I'm gonna get name Andrew, which is really useful to be able to create a database that like makes sense, where it's not like, in this microservice, it thinks the name is Andrew. In this microservice, it thinks the name is Maria. And testers are like, is that a bug? Or is that the data is just bad? And it can never be the data is just bad. Otherwise, our users get angry at us.
So for Mockaroo, there's a very common use case that there's a tutorial video on. If you just go to the help section of Mockaroo, one of the tutorials I have up there is you create a schema, and then you can create a data set based on that schema. It's stored in Mockaroo, and then you can reference that data set in future data sets. So you could generate, primary key information in one data set and then reference that as foreign key information in another data set. That's how you build out the referential integrity. So it's absolutely, very common thing. As far as repeatability, Mockaroo, the design is biased towards randomness, controlled randomness, or generated trends. So it's less common to want to generate things that are the same every time. So most of the data types you'll find kind of default to generating random things within a range or due to some distribution that you can control. But certainly with things like formulas and constants, you can have the same data every time. So it's kind of a meta question. Like when you design a trend, you should get about the same trend every time, but obviously it's different data points in it. So you have a fair bit of control, I would say.
Cool. Before I jump to, there's one question that came in earlier that I'm happy to answer. Someone asked about the relationship between Tonic and Mockaroo. The relationship is really, we both kind of were early players in the space, big fans of fake data. The founders connected early on, and we really enjoy chatting, having these conversations with Mark, because there's a lot of overlap in what we do, but there are also differences. We solve two different use cases, from taking existing data to creating data from scratch. So products are independent, if that was part of the question, not integrated or anything. All right.
Yeah, I just like hanging out with Kiara and Andrew. So
exactly. we have good conversations.
If you joined early, you would have noticed, like before we started, we were just like bantering about whatever. And so that's kind of the glue that keeps it all together.
Yep. Wish we could have these conversations more frequently, honestly. All right, so this actually speaks to that, two different use cases. Someone asked, more often than not, we do not have access to this production database. Is there a way Tonic can look at the schemas, metadata, and generate fake data in a lower level environment?
That is a Mockaroo use case more than a Tonic use case, because Tonic really is designed for, you have some guide of what the data should look like from data.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for punting that one to me, because I get the same question and it's really tough to answer because you have to think it through. What people are often asking is like, okay, take a look at my database table and you've got integer, varchar, date time, integer. Can you generate fake data based on that? It's like, I don't know anything about what's actually in that other than there's some strings and some integers, and I know roughly the length that I can stuff in there, but I don't know whether those strings are names or ages or addresses or whatnot. So it is actually really difficult to learn just based on a schema. So one of the bare bones things that Mockaroo does to accelerate that is you can literally just like take the DDL for a table and paste it in Mockaroo, and it'll grab all the column names and pre-fill with just blank data types. You have to choose them. That's about the best it can do. So in a way, it is like maybe that's a better use case for Mockaroo, but you're going to have some work. Like you're going to have to tell Mockaroo what it's going to do.
The one thing I would say, like that Mockaroo has, the thing that I was thinking when I mentioned that is like Mockaroo has a ton of different industry specific and also generic data creation things. Like, I mean, you could probably speak to it better than I can, but you've got things from like VINs to like ICD-10 codes to probably shipping container code. I mean, every ID that you can think of, Mockaroo has a way of creating that ID that fits for that data type. Whereas Tonic, it's like much more like, I see you have IDs that look like this. I can make more IDs like that. It doesn't have like a specific way of making a specific kind of ID. It just sort of apes what's already in the database.
Yeah. And maybe that goes to building. Like one of the tips I would have for anybody who's trying to build one of these things on their own is I kind of built it to be a little meta in that there's an easy way for me as a developer in Mockaroo to take like a CSV data set and just make a data type out of that. And so a lot of the same code is reused to like just pick random rows out of that data set. And it's allowed me to extend things with tons of data types over time. So if you're thinking about building something on your own, think about maybe the future be a lot easier rather than having to code a generator for every single thing, just to be able to take flat file data sets from the public and plug them into a system.
Mm-hmm.
That was actually one of my questions for both of you, is like, what are like the top 3 considerations to keep in mind if someone is setting out to build their own solution?
It's much harder than you think it is. I've already said that.
That's not what I mean.
Item 1, item 2, and item 3. Much harder than you think. No. One thing that I think kind of surprised us the reason why it was harder than we thought it would be, to keep harping on that, but is that like the interconnectedness and richness of data is really deep. And if you think you can just say, well, I'm just going to replace this value with a random string, to the point we were talking about earlier, if like I got int varchar, what do I do with that? You're basically wrong. Like there is very few use cases where just a random string is going to suffice. And so already you're starting to look at like, okay, well, what kinds of strings exist in this database? Addresses, usernames, telephone numbers, etc. And so there's a big richness there. And then that's just like richness of data type in the sense that like, okay, there's the data type that's string, but really the data type is address, right? And then there's a richness of like the interconnectedness of the data that is very difficult to capture and simulate with, when you're generating this fake data. And by that, I mean like, just as a simple example I use a lot, if you look at like claims data is every time you go to the doctor, you make a medical claim to your insurance. So they have all that in data and like everything is in there, right? Like you got a shot, they gave you aspirin. Those are 2 different claims. And there's going to be a story in there. There's going to be a story of a person who went to the doctor, then got an MRI on their knee, then got a knee replacement, then got PT. And like having those stories in the data is really, really, really hard. And something that, it's like the peeling the onion. You're like, when you're doing this, like, oh, it's not gonna be that bad. And you start peeling the onion, you're like, oh my goodness, I need to simulate a person getting a knee replacement. That's going to be hard. So yeah, the richness I think is a thing that if you were going to do this on your own, pay attention to that. Think about that up front.
Mark, what about you?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is usability. Like as a developer, you build something and it's probably going to make sense for you, but the leap for it to make sense for anybody else and anybody else of a different background or different skill set that's really rough. And like a lot of times the people that could actually build a data generator or something that can generate lots of volumes of data at scale quickly are not also the people that like to worry about usability and user interface design and whatnot. Like most developers hate that stuff. So if your audience is a less technical crew than you are, which is probably likely for anybody who's thinking about building this, building something that they can use and empowers them is a really serious challenge, I think. I think that's where I kind of got lucky. that I seem to have done that. And I don't know how. But so another one is the cost of keeping the resources running. And maybe if you're a big company, like you don't care. But if you're not a big company, if you build something and it's not optimized, just keeping those servers running for the 99% of the time when no one's using them to generate, data, that may be a serious cost. So there are technologies you can use to mitigate that, like functions as a service or serverless, where you're just paying for the amount of compute time that you use. But then again, you have to know those technologies, and they're kind of new and raw. And it actually takes time to consider how to build this thing in a way that's like cost effective. But then also, I think probably the most important thing is just like the people cost to maintain a system like this, which is going to be really interesting for the month that you're building it, and then not so much for the next 10 years that you have to support it. And it's not likely to be anything that's truly important to the business. So the people supporting it will be second-class citizens, and it's just no fun. So yeah, it's funny because I always want to build everything myself, but if anybody who works for me wants to build something themselves, I always force them to buy instead of build. So yeah, there's a lot of cost to be considered there.
Yeah.
Interesting. We have a question that I think the answer will be short. So I know we're coming up on the hour, but can either of your tools create images of people's faces in a JPEG format with a limited image size?
No, at least not Tonic. Don't want to speak for Mockaroo, but we focused on structured data.
Yeah, for Mockaroo, I think there is an avatar type, but there's a great site out there that I should just integrate with. In fact, I think I'm going to go do that after this because it's probably really simple. I think if you Google "this person does not exist," it's literally like AI to create a person that looks totally real, but they're not a person that actually exists. And I'm pretty sure they have an API and you can control image size and stuff there. So I just need to plug that into Mockaroo, but that's a great question because it's a great idea for a new data type.
There's another tool I just came across that also uses AI, and I'm blanking on the name, which is not very helpful. But you can basically take multiple images of people's faces and merge them and like kind of say, okay, I want to up the characteristics of that person's face, decrease. You play around. If anybody out in the audience knows knows what that is called, it's not that way. Yeah, it was something art. It had a weird name that like grammatically didn't make sense. So grammatic things that don't make sense don't tend to stick in my brain, I guess. So the last comment, not so much a question that came through, but maybe giving you guys an idea for time series. Just want to make sure you saw that in the chat. What about the generating threads, adding a random interval to the rows and then a post processor converting a known start timestamp by adding those sequentially? Not sure how that was.
Yeah, I think that was Tom suggesting a solution to my time series problem before. I thought about things like that. What makes that difficult is Mockaroo is right now a one-pass algorithm. I mean, it just goes from start to finish, and there's no like post-processing of all the data. And sometimes, generating all that data takes quite a while, and it's an immense volume of data in the end. So making a second pass and reading that data after it's been assembled from all these different workers is like a whole order of magnitude more work and complexity. So I have not jumped that shark yet. That I've thought about that very solution, but from fundamentally a one pass to a two pass or multiple pass system is a thing I don't want to do if I can all help it.
I did find that website that is kind of like this person does not exist, called artbreeder.com. Like I said,
there's this person does not exist.com also is a thing.
Right. That is, and then Artbreeder is the one where you can take multiple images and merge them in some way and kind of like toggle the characteristics of those images. So people use that to create fake faces in like the context of, I don't know, creating characters for a story or something. That was interesting. I think that is all the questions that we have. Any final thoughts from either of you guys on any of what we discussed?
Well, having perused this person does not exist, it's really convincing unless there's like another person in the image and then that other person is broken. Just like really creepy. I'm going to share my screen. We can end on this.
Okay.
Here we go.
Oh dear.
Wow.
So this person, super convincing. This person
does not exist.
Does not exist.
Thank goodness.
Interesting. I'm also willing to bet that person on the left mostly exists. I don't think that one's been scraped together from as many different images as the one in the center.
Oh, interesting. That's an interesting point. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, before we say goodbye, I just wanted to give a shout out to some more webinars that we have coming up kind of on this subject as well later in the year. We've got one in November, one in December. December's webinar is again going to be focused on build versus buy, but with a targeted focus on enterprise ROI analysis. So kind of looking at some of the numbers behind what we've discussed here. And so keep your eyes out for that on the events page at Tonic.ai. And then in November, we're going to be looking at fake data and patterns. We recently released an ebook on the subject, all the ways fake data can fail you and how you can avoid those pitfalls. So keep your eye out for invitation emails and for the events on the website. Awesome. Thanks from Finland. We got awesome to hear that someone's chiming in from Finland. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Andrew. Like we said earlier, these conversations are always great. Looking forward to the next one.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.